Hello, welcome to our second speaker series for the season. And welcome people who are virtual. We will be hearing Richard Adamczyk, who will be giving his talk titled Cumberland County's Original People, an overview of pre-contact Native Americans in Southern New Jersey. Please save all your questions at the end, and if anyone virtually has any questions, just put it in the chat bar and we will answer those as well. So Richard serves as the curator of the Ewing Carman Museum of Prehistory in Cumberland County and helps preserve, interpret, and educate about the region's indigenous history. He also works as an archaeologist in the environmental protection industry, serving and excavating historical sites to recover information about the past before it's lost. Richard earned his master's in anthropology from Monmouth University and specials in the pre-contact archaeology of New Jersey. So welcome, Richard.
Thank you so much, Rick. I'm going to take my mask off just so the virtual people can hear me a little better, so I apologize. All right.
Yeah.
All right, so today I'm just going to be talking briefly about the overview of the Native American people that lived here in New Jersey, specifically down here in Cumberland County. But to start, I think the best way to go over how people first populated the area, I want to talk about how people first came into the continent of North America. So I'm sure most people have heard throughout their education growing up the story of the Bering Land Bridge. So when people first came into the North American continent, they were coming during the end of the Pleistocene era, also known as the last ice age, when there were these massive ice sheets that covered the northern extents of the continent over Canada and northern continental US, which trapped a large amount of the seawater and let sea levels be much lower and exposing large portions of the continental shelf that were then able to be traversed, including the Bering Land Bridge from Siberia over to Alaska. So the first Native Americans that came here would have crossed this land bridge, and original theories suggested that they would have come across this blue route on the map, coming through the interior of the continent when the ice sheets pulled apart, roughly about 14,000 years ago. But more recent investigations are suggesting that it's likely people came much earlier before the ice sheets pulled apart, and it's likely that they actually came down along the coastal route shown by the red arrows going down along the northwestern coast. They've actually found archaeological sites that dated very early along the coast. There's a site called Triquet Island where they had a Native American fireplace that they were able to radiocarbon date to about 12,000 BC, which is a nice early date for that region and helps prove, or at least lend credence to the theory that they were coming down along the coast before the ice sheets split. Some other early sites that have been found throughout North America include Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in western Pennsylvania, about 6 hours west of here. They have dates that go as early as 12,000 BC, and possibly even earlier, some more contested dates that might extend as early as maybe 14,000 BC. There have also been recent investigations in Idaho at a site called Cooper's Ferry that has really solid 14,000 BC dates, which is much earlier than people originally thought Native Americans were here. So that was an exciting find. And now I don't know how much people tune into the news on archaeology lately, but very recently there have been stories going around of a publication from White Sands National Park in New Mexico, where they have fossilized human footprints that they were able to pretty securely date around 20,000 BC or earlier, which is like an incredible date for prehistoric archaeologists. We're used to saying people were here, maybe 14,000 BC at the earliest. And so 20,000 is an incredible date, and it's really exciting for these early sites. Here in the Delaware Valley, the earliest site that we have is from northeastern Pennsylvania. It's called the Shawnee-Minisink site, and they have secure dates from about 9,000 BC. So when we're talking about the earliest people in the Delaware Valley region, that's usually around what we're talking about, somewhere between 10 and 9,000 BC. when people first inhabited this area. So the Paleo-Indian period is the first period of New Jersey's prehistory. Archaeologists generally separate the periods into about three very general overview cultural history periods. The Paleo-Indian period describes the period of people that lived during the end of the Ice Age that were living in an incredibly different environment than we have today. So like I mentioned before, there were massive ice sheets that covered the northern extents of the continent that kept sea levels very low and created these very tundra-like environments down in the New Jersey region. So it would have been very sparsely vegetated, mostly grasslands with few trees. And the environment would have been inhabited by what are called Pleistocene megafauna, which isn't just another word for very large animals. They're Ice Age animals, such as mammoth, mastodon, giant beavers, ground sloths, things like that. And the Native Americans that lived in the region would have been hunting these creatures, as well as other small game, and gathering whatever wild foods they could get their hands on. It was a very harsh environment, very difficult to live in. And the people lived in relatively small, mobile bands of hunter-gatherers. They weren't really able to sustain large populations in this kind of environment because it was so difficult to live in and so harsh. One of the most notable artifacts that come from this period are what are called fluted points, or Clovis points, which are named after the Clovis site in New Mexico where they were first found. They're found pretty ubiquitously throughout North America. So it's really interesting to see them here in New Jersey as well. It's a very North American culture, not very localized. These two artifacts here on the screen are two fluted points from the collections at the Carman Museum. Both of these were washed up on the bay shore. So like I mentioned before, sea levels were much lower during the Paleo-Indian period, and therefore the Delaware Bay would have been much lower. And so there were likely, at least hypothetically, Paleo-Indian sites along the Delaware River with the former shoreline that would have been drowned and submerged after the end of the Ice Age and after the sea levels rose. So we have artifacts like this that occasionally wash up on the beach from these submerged sites. These artifacts, the fluted points, likely would have been used as a sort of Swiss Army knife type artifact. They would have used it for whatever they could, primarily as spear points, as knives, scrapers, things like that. Because they were so mobile, they had to keep their toolkit relatively limited to whatever they could carry with them. And those distinct channels, I don't know if you can see very well on the screen, but in the center of the blade, there are these rectangular channels that were flaked out of it that would have made it easier to haft onto some sort of shaft or handle. And though that technology, flaking out that channel, is very specific to this period. So if you find a spear point that looks like that, it's old, it's definitely old, which is a pretty interesting marker. And it's interesting how that technology doesn't continue into later periods. And this is just a map that I included of the original shorelines during the Paleo-Indian period and the end of the Ice Age. So you can see if that's the present coast of New Jersey, this is where it used to be around 11,000 years ago. And as the ice sheets melted, the sea level, the shoreline continued west. And you can see, like I mentioned before, in the Delaware Bay, that used to all be land down that way. So after the end of the Ice Age comes what we call the Archaic period, which lasted around 8,000 BC, around the end of the Ice Age, to about 1,000 BC. So it was an incredibly long period of time that's marked by the new environments that developed at the end of the Ice Age. These were resource-rich woodland environments, which included new kinds of floral and faunal resources that they could subsist on. No longer were they hunting things like mammoth and mastodon. We're seeing the hunting of white-tailed deer, gathering wild berries, nuts, things like that to subsist on. They still generally traveled in small bands of hunter-gatherers that circled the landscape in seasonal patterns, with larger camps focused around more significant waterways, such as the Ramsey River or the Morris River, or even along the bay shore. And then with smaller specialized camps looking for specific types of resources along the tributaries of those rivers and waterways, targeting different resources at different times of the year. So while Paleo-Indian artifacts such as these were typically made of more exotic stone that might have been quarried from rock formations from out of state to get really nice, fine, exotic cherts, such as from New York or Ohio. During the Archaic period, we tend to see more use of localized materials, stuff that they were able to get without traveling too far, or trading too far. For example, these are some artifacts that are made of a material called Cohansey quartzite. These are actually mined out of a rock outcrop that's right here in Greenwich. It's actually the only place in New Jersey that you can find this type of stone here in Greenwich. And the artifacts that are made out of it have been found throughout all of southern New Jersey. So it's interesting to see that that system of trade and travel for this type of material that's localized to this exact spot. Some of the other artifacts that showed up during the Archaic period to help them live in these new woodland environments include artifacts such as this axe here. This is a rootstone axe. Axes are indicators that they were able to modify their environments, clear trees, build houses, wigwams, longhouses, things like that, using the lumber as well as canoes for travel. You also have artifacts like these here. These are plummets or net sinkers, which have been tied to the ends of nets and used for fishing. After the end of the Ice Age, and the waterways became much more habitable to these fish resources, and they were able to fish both along the major rivers and at the bay shore. We also have artifacts like the mortar and pestle that show up, helping them to grind things like nuts and other wild plant foods for the production of foods. Sometimes pigments can be produced using tools like this for painting and decoration adornment. And we also have artifacts like these that show up around the middle of the Archaic period. They're called banner stones. They were originally called banner stones because the first archaeologists that found them weren't quite sure what they were used for. And they thought that these intricate, like wing-shaped or kind of shield-shaped artifacts, I don't know if you can see them. No, the lighting is a little off. But these artifacts actually have holes drilled right through them, going this way and that way. Hard to tell. You can see the artifact on the left there, that fragmented piece, that's the interior of the drill hole going through it, if that helps you visualize it a little better. But these artifacts were originally interpreted as sort of banners. They thought that these drilled holes allowed them to place it on the end of some sort of staff and hold it up as some sort of ceremonial piece. Because the banner stones that they were finding were so ornately decorated, they were very finely polished, very neatly done compared to a lot of the other Native American tools. Now, research generally suggests that that's not what they were used for. We tend to think that they were attached to spear throwers and used as a kind of counterweight. I did bring, this is called an atlatl, just to show you. This isn't a banner stone here, but it kind of shows, serves the same purpose. So the idea of a banner stone would be as a counterweight to the spear thrower, attached to it like this, probably, you know, with the bore hole attached on the shaft that way, with the wings extending off. And then it would have been used to throw spears. So I'm not going to throw the spear in here. I don't think Britt would like it. But you would hook the spear, there's a hole in the end, and you hook it into the hook on the spear thrower. You hold it like that. And then instead of throwing the spear like this, you would flick your wrist and throw it like that. And you see it makes my arm that much longer and gives me that much more thrust, that much more leverage. So you could throw your spears much farther, much more accurate. And so they think that the banner stones were used as counterweights to that kind of technology. This technology is how Native Americans were hunted throughout the Paleo-indian, Archaic, and beginning of the next period. The bow and arrow doesn't appear until much later in Native American history. So most of the points that you find out there are usually spear points or dart points rather than arrowheads. All right, so coming towards the end of the Archaic period, we start seeing artifacts like this. This is a bowl made out of stone. It's called a steatite or soapstone, which is a very soft stone that can be carved relatively easily. And they started making containers out of this stuff for transporting and cooking food. And right at the end of the Archaic period, they start doing this until they realize that they can bake clay and create ceramic technology. And the creation of ceramic technology is where we mark the beginning of the Woodland period, which was around 1000 BC, about 3000 years ago. We start seeing actual fire plant pottery. During the Woodland period, Native Americans settled in even larger, more permanent settlements. They were starting to reduce their foraging radii and settling in more specific locations with larger populations. They also began growing crops such as corn, beans, and squash. I don't know if you learned about that when you learned about Thanksgiving in elementary school. The Native people were growing corn, beans, and squash. They were crops that really kind of supplemented each other, both nutritionally and when growing them. If you grew them together in the same garden, they kind of shared nutrients in such a way that supported the growth of all three, which is interesting that the Native people were really able to take advantage of that and produce their food that way. During the Woodland period, they were likely still, hunting, gathering wild foods. They weren't doing large-scale farms or irrigating or anything like that, but they were likely having small gardens in the back of their villages to help them supplement their diets with these types of foods and give them, just another opportunity to get food more security in their diets. You also see in the bottom left corner here, I have a couple pictures of actual arrowheads. So about 1000 AD is when you see the invention of bow and arrow technology, marked by these tiny little triangular arrow tips that show up in the archaeological record. I also have here, this is just another picture. I don't know how well it comes out on the screen, but this is just another picture of Native American pottery that shows some of the impressive decorative motifs that they use. This pot shows at least 3 different motifs that they used. Along the neck here, this top bit, you can see they have incised lines. And on the left side, they have punctated decorations. And along the body of the pot, they have cord impressed decorations along the surface. So they actually would have probably wrapped some sort of wooden paddle with cordage and then pressed it to get this kind of like knot-like design all across the surface of the pot. And we can actually date a lot of the pottery to exactly which periods, which portions of the Woodland period they were more popularly used based on the designs and pulling them out of datable contexts. Right. So somewhere around 1600 AD, give or take a few decades, we see European contact with native groups here. It was like the first Europeans that came here to southern New Jersey were likely explorers like Giovanni de Verrazano or Henry Hudson. They would have met up with these late Woodland period cultural groups that belong to generally the cultural group that we call the Lenape that lived here in southern New Jersey throughout the Delaware Valley. They extended into eastern PA, northern Delaware, and southern New York. The Lenape is kind of like an overarching term. There likely were a lot more complex, smaller cultural groups that were identified living along different drainages and within different family settlement patterns. We know that in southern New Jersey, they were speaking a dialect of the Algonquin language called the Unami dialect. When the Europeans first made contact with the Native Americans, most historical documents suggest that they were generally peaceful to the original Dutch, Swedish, and English traders that were coming up the Delaware River. But going into the mid to late 17th century, English occupation generally led to heavy losses for the Native Americans, mostly due to epidemic, as well as intertribal warfare, land disputes, and other conflicts, which severely reduced the Native population going into the colonial period. Some indigenous people moved west to Pennsylvania and Ohio, while some remained here. There was, in the mid-18th century, there was a reservation in Burlington County, today called Chemung. The reservation was called Brotherton. It didn't last for very long. It wasn't particularly successful. It kind of disbanded. And most of the Lenape that were living here in New Jersey moved west into Oklahoma, Wisconsin, and Canada. But there are still some groups that do live here, especially up in Bridgeton. There's the Nanticoke Colonial Lenape group that are still here, as well as some other groups that sometimes struggle with recognition by federal and state organizations that are supposed to recognize these tribes that have ancestral claim to the area. But I'm going to briefly talk about some of the archaeology that's been done in Cumberland County to help learn more about the Native people that lived here. Early surveys in the early 20th century mapped a lot of the sites that were throughout New Jersey, and they identified a great density of sites in Bridgeton, Fairfield, here in Greenwich, and that's Stowe Creek. Dorothy Cross, who was the first state archaeologist, she was working in the 1940s and conducted several excavations in the Bridgeton area and found a great deal of Native American pottery, as well as some of the Cohanson quartzite that I was talking about earlier. This map shows the reported locations of several finds and site types throughout the county. It was originally compiled by Alan Carman, who helped establish the museum that I'm working at now, from a lot of collectors in the area reporting some of their finds and some of his own personal excavations. And he put together this kind of general overview of where Native people were congregated in the county. As you can see, there's a few different marked site types. The red triangles marks where some of the larger habitation sites were, the seasonally visited, sometimes village sites, things like that, as well as some of the green dots show shell fishing stations, which also tend to be seasonally revisited, usually during the warm seasons of coming out in the summer to take advantage of those marine resources. And the blue shapes also show some of the zones of occupation for smaller camps when they were splintering off to more specialized resource procurement areas, when they were looking for specific hunting camps, looking for specific collections of rock outcrops or clay beds from either water or other kinds of resources that they were targeting before congregating again at the larger sites. As you can see, like I mentioned before, Native American occupation typically gathered around the major waterways. They were great for transportation and for getting resources, and you can see perfectly that they almost directly line up with the Cohanson and Morris rivers. Unfortunately, a lot of these sites were just simply reported, and so I can kind of get an idea of where they are out of that, but I don't have much more information about them because they were reported with no accompanying information or artifacts, things like that. So a lot of professional archaeology done in this county is lacking. Most professional archaeology today is done in advance of development, which Cumberland doesn't seem to have as much of as far as some of the counties to the north. So I know at my other job, we do a lot of work for the construction of warehouses. And so, especially in like Salem County and Gloucester County, we're doing a lot of work and finding a lot of Native American sites, but it's not so much here. So a lot of the sites here are actually kind of preserved and missing that kind of professional eye to them. I am going to talk briefly about one particular site that has been identified here in Cumberland, and it's a really great example of the prehistory and some of the processes that come to learning about Native Americans in this county, which is the Indian Head site. So sorry about the picture. That was the only one that I could find in the site area online. It's a little grainy, a bit outdated. But the Indian Head site is a massive Native American site that was identified near Vineland along the Morris River. It's easily one of the largest sites in the entire state of New Jersey. It's definitely the largest one in Cumberland. And it was likely originally identified by collectors, people that were really interested in going out and finding Native American artifacts, and realized that there was a great density of artifacts at this particular site. Professional excavation was done in 1940 by Dorothy Cross, I mentioned before, the first state archaeologist, and they found an immense wealth of artifacts that span the entire breadth of prehistory. They found one fragment of a fluted point, a Clovis point, so it showed people were occupied there at least 8,000, 10,000 years ago, all the way up through the late Woodland type periods and everything in between. So it's unfortunate that the site was actually targeted over many years by collectors, and so a lot of artifacts were taken away and were never documented by professional excavation. So there's some information that's missing. There's holes, if you will, in the archaeological record. But later excavation by Alan Mounier in the 60s, 70s, and 80s did reveal more wealth of information, artifacts that went around. Some of the stuff that was found included an immense amount of stone projectile points, knives, scrapers for scraping flesh off of hides for the production of clothes, and shells for wigwams and things like that. Stone drills for drilling holes in clothes and stone. They were actually able to drill through stone with stone. which I thought was pretty impressive. Axes and celts, which is a type of ungrooved axe, which again shows that they were modifying the environment to suit their needs and to get lumber for houses and canoes and tools and things like that. Mortars and pestles have been found at the site. Even gorgets, which are kind of like necklaces, like amulets. They were decorative. They're very highly polished for adornment, typically worn around the neck, as well as banner stones, like I mentioned before, and an incredible amount of pottery that they found at the site. Just 1 year of excavation at the site, they found over 1,600 pieces of Native American pottery. They found incinerated food remains, so typically bones from animals and game that they were eating would decay in New Jersey's acidic soils, but they were able to find preserved bones that were incinerated and calcined that survived into the record. And they found evidence of deer, box turtle, birds, snakes, rabbits, and skunks that they were all subsisting on at the site. They found intact hearths or fireplaces consisting of fire-altered stone platforms. So just these large platforms of stone that show evidence of being baked in very specific circular patterns that can show where there were fires, where they were cooking food and drying out food and things like that. As well as intact caches of stone tools that were documented in place, soil stains left over from posts. So when they're building structures such as wigwams, you drive a post into the ground, and when that post decays, there's a soil stain left where it was. And during very careful excavation, we can actually identify where those posts are and kind of map out where the structures were in the site. The site has been interpreted as a site of frequent visitation during seasonal movements over a very long period of time, leaving behind a wealth of material culture that resulted from all the activities that were conducted on the site. It's likely a large revisited village or a large encampment that served as a base station or some sort of hub where several family bands could congregate before splintering off along smaller waterways in search of specialized resources. I also included this graphic that I found online here because I thought it was really important to note that when archaeologists are looking for Native American artifacts, we're not necessarily just looking for artifacts, we're looking for the context that they come in. So if you just have it, you see here, it's like mentioning a large object, place unknown, final location unknown, age unknown, because these are all things that we can't really figure out just by looking at an object. We can compare artifacts to artifacts that we found in the proper context, but on its own, it doesn't give us much information. So when we do proper excavation on sites, we can find artifacts in pit features or in post molds or in association with each other that can help us date them and find the association and kind of piece together the story of the activities conducted on site, as opposed to just digging them out and looking at a pretty artifact, which is really nice and neat, but it doesn't really tell the whole story. So it's interesting and important to understand with archaeology that it's important not to take these artifacts out of their context whenever possible. All right, just a few closing thoughts. The Native Americans that lived in southern New Jersey, while most of them have moved west or have died due to epidemics, they're not a lost, unknown people. There are still Native Americans living here today. They're a cultural group just like any other. And we can study their heritage through the excavation of stuff left behind by their ancestors that have been here for thousands of years. There's been a comparatively low frequency of professional excavation in Cumberland County, so there's a great more for us to learn. This is only just a piece of a general overview, and there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. And it's also important to remember that taking artifacts out of context is generally makes it difficult for archaeologists to put back together a lot of the information about the past. If we can look at the whole picture of where these artifacts came from, it really helps us to learn more about the people that used them. And that's everything that I have. I have credits for all the pictures that I used because I didn't make any of them. I'll just leave that up. And if anybody has any questions for me, I'd be love to answer some of them. Yeah.
You mentioned that there's still a lot of work to be done in Cumberland County. Is there any kind of organized effort to move ahead with that, or at least to preserve what's remaining, so that when the time comes and people are available to do it, with that kind of work.
That's a really great question, actually. So there isn't there's sites like Indian Head, there is an organized effort to keep it protected and keep it from a lot of the artifacts being lost. Other than that, most of this, not even in Cumberland County, just the state's archaeological resources tend to be left where they are unless they're known to be in immediate danger. And then those things can be brought to state authorities to try and see if there's a way to excavate these sites before they're lost, things like that. But generally, we try to leave things where they are. We don't typically look to do a lot of excavation if we think that a site is relatively stable where it is, because the idea is archaeologists 10, 20, 30 years from now will have better methods, better technologies to gain more information when they excavate the site. We always learn when you're studying archaeology that it's a destructive science. You can't excavate a site that's been excavated. Once you remove the soil and take the artifact out of it, that's that. You can't repeat it. It's not repeatable. So we try to do as little bit as possible under the assumption that future archaeologists will be able to do a better job than we will. So we excavate sites that are immediately threatened. My other job, the work that I tend to do, is part of the environmental protection industry, dealing with state permits and things like that. If developments are threatening sites, before they dig up their area, we will go out and do excavation to recover the data before it's lost.
Are there efforts to protect the areas that you know of so that they are not destroyed and not excavated by, not inexpert people?
It depends on what kind of land it is. If it's privately owned land that doesn't require state permits and things like that, which are typically what require archaeology in turn. If you need a state permit to develop your land, you have to take into consideration your effect on the environment, including the archaeology. And that's what instigates our work. But if you're on private land that doesn't need that kind of permit, there's really nothing that can be done if someone decides they want to tear up the site. Anything, according to United States law, anything that is buried on your property is yours. So that includes archaeological sites.
Thank you.
Yes.
I don't know if it was true or not, but we live in Salem County, but I had heard that when they were developing the Wawa in Bridgeton, that there was a halt because they found artifacts on that site. Is that true?
I don't know how much I'm allowed to talk about. My company did the excavation there, so I don't know how much I can talk about it. I can say personally, when I was out on that site digging, I found nothing but trash.
Okay,
But-
I heard that and then I thought that you
I
were
did-
the one.
I was not high up on the chain of command on that project. I don't know what was found before we went out there. All I know is that when we went out there to do excavations to look for things, we didn't find anything. Yes,
The location that you called Indian Head,
yes.
where is that?
It's near Vineland. It's along the Morris River, like just outside the city.
So is there, are there yellow tapes there, do not trespass?
It's on private property, so I believe it's fenced in,
Okay,
but like the exact spot is generally not shared because it's been so frequently repeated that there are a lot of people going there taking stuff. It's generally not kosher to be sharing specific locational information for archaeological sites like that.
so you can't go visit it, you can't.
No, you can't
It's
go.
not like you're going down to the monument
Correct.
for the two
Yes.
burners. You can't say,
It's,
hey, there it is.
yeah, it's generally trying not to tell people where it is just because of that particular threat to it.
Thank you.
Yes.
Another location question, but in a broader sense, on the map, you had mentioned that there were a few major areas that were higher concentrations. Can you just repeat what those major areas were?
It was just generally along the Cohansey and Morris rivers.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
especially-
I think you mentioned like
Oh, but
Fairfield, Soap Creek, Bridgeton.
Yeah,
I
it
didn't
was-
catch all of that.
Bridgeton, Fairfield, Stowe Creek, and there's one more. Here in Greenwich. You would think. that would be- Yes.
Was there a group of Indians called Cohansik, or is that a native name to the people around the Cohansik River?
I'm honestly not.
Can't hear her.
entirely-
What was her
The que-
question?
The question was if there was a group of Native Americans called the Cohansik group. I'm not too familiar because there are so many smaller groups
There are.
that were all within like the umbrella term of the Lenape, and I'm not familiar with all of them. It's possible that there was. A lot of names for Native American groups were given by Europeans or by themselves or by some anglicized version of their name. It's incredibly complex, and I honestly just don't have that much education in it.
We have an online question.
Sure.
Have you done research into 19th and 20th century history of the Lenape people? If so, please share some of your thoughts.
I personally haven't done a lot of that research, but there's definitely been a wealth of research into that. A professor named Marshall Becker from Westchester University does a lot of work with what's called ethnohistoric or historical ethnoarchaeology, some fancy word like that. And he basically looks at these historical accounts of interaction with the Lenape to kind of understand their culture and their interaction with the European people and how that's affected their culture. And he's done an incredible amount of publications, especially in the Bulletin of the Archaeological Society of New Jersey has a lot of his work in there. But I personally haven't done a lot of research into it.
His name again?
Marshall Becker is his name.
Thank you.
Yes.
Are there particular artifact types that you see from the contact period that aren't necessarily collected prior to that?
That's a really good question, actually. So during the contact period, I should have touched on this earlier. You see some of the artifacts that are great examples of interaction between Native people and the Europeans. So you see trade goods that Native Americans were giving to the Lenape people. One of the big ones are glass beads. So Native Americans, before the Europeans arrived, they were very interested in wampum, which is like a shell bead, crafting beads out of shell with that kind of pearlescence look to them. And so Europeans kind of mimicked that with glass beads, specifically blue glass beads, and they would trade them during their commercial interactions for things like furs and foods. You also see a lot of copper. Native Americans didn't have ready access to copper. They did use copper in the Great Lakes region. There are actually outcrops of copper metal that could be cold hammered. So rather than melting it and forging it into something like an axe or some other tool, they were able to just use very hard stone and just hammer this ore into usable tools. And it was considered incredibly valuable for them. But when the Europeans came over, they had a much more ready supply of copper. And so it was really valuable to them as a trade commodity. Another one of my favorite artifacts from the contact period is when Native Americans started to adopt firearms like muskets and things like that. Flintlock pistols, they would, if they didn't have the flint for a flintlock, they were actually able to take local stone that they already knew how to work in their stone tool manufacture. And they were able to create gun flints out of local stone instead of the English and French flints that they were typically made out of. So we can actually, when we dig a contact period site, and we find these like local stones that are shaped with a particular manufacturer skill that was specific to Native Americans, that was used as a gun flint. It was very interesting to see them adapt European technology that way with their own technology and their skills. Any questions?
I had a question about just so wherever you're walking around, after you see it or an artifact or dig it up. If you take a picture of like with your digital phone, doesn't that keep the information about like the time, date, location? Data?
I think it depends on your phone. I think it depends on the software, but a lot of phones do that now, where they'll keep metadata where it came from. That's a good question. If you like do end up stumbling upon like an artifact when you're out on a hike or something like that, it is helpful, at least from an archaeological perspective, from a museum perspective. We would love if you could tell us where it was, take a picture of it, tell us where you found it. That helps us keep track of where some of these sites are for our own research. It's also important to remember, like I mentioned before, anything that is on your private property, whether it's buried or not, technically belongs to you, including archaeological resources. So I think it's important for people to know if you're out looking for stuff like this, be careful where you are, because if you're on private property, it's not yours to take, and you could get in trouble with stuff like that.
Another line question. Do you have any evidence of the Norsemen contact in this area? Are there any artifacts and materials from Europe prior to the 1600s?
There actually are not this far south in New Jersey. There are sites up in Newfoundland in Canada where they have actually seen evidence of Vikings that came over before people like Henry Hudson and Giovanni de Verrazano and all these other European explorers. So they had Viking sites that was, I think they're from 1400 AD, something like that, relatively early. And they found examples of Viking coins and tools and things like that. They likely had these coastal trading posts and possibly even traded with the Native Americans up there. But there's no evidence of that down here. It's been suggested there have been artifacts found in the Chesapeake Bay that some people had suggested were French in origin, like glazed like stone tool technology found in the Chesapeake Bay that some had thought may have been from this like French culture, the Solutrean culture it was called, that was way earlier. I forget how old it is. It's like maybe like before 20,000 years or so, before the standard that we know of Native Americans being here. And people were thinking, oh, well, maybe the first Native Americans weren't from Siberia, maybe they were from Europe. But it's a really sketchy theory. There's not a lot of evidence to go with it. I think, I don't know if I can flip back to the graphic before. But can you go back to the map, the second slide?
Oh, this one, no, second slide.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's this route that they were talking about, I think, which the date they put. I think it says 14,000 years ago, but I don't know. But yeah, it's not generally accepted. There's still a lot of research going into it, and it would be a very interesting theory, but there's still a lot of work to go on that to get that like, sufficient credibility. Yeah.
Can you tell us of any progress being made toward the new museum that's going to combine, from what I understand, with what's in Bridgeton?
Yes. So as far as I understand, we started raising the funds for the new museum. There's already been a significant donation towards it. And if we haven't already, we started working towards actively campaigning for those funds to raise towards the new museum. So we're working on that now. I'm working with an exhibitions consultant and we're working on getting plans put together for how all the artifacts will be put together and displayed and interpreted, things like that.
No timetable. Depends on what.
3 to 5 years? I don't know.
One step at a time.
Yeah, we're working on it. We are currently at the museum that's there now. While we're closed for the winter, we're working on putting together some new displays. So when we open on April 2nd, we're going to have a few new galleries put up, new exhibit cases. So there'll be something new if you've been to the museum before. There'll be something new to look at when we're in April. If anyone's interested in something about it. Yes.
You as an archaeologist, have you ever met up with some of the locals around here that some people have some pretty massive collections in their homes of Indian artifacts and stuff?
I've spoken to some of them. Some of them have come to the museum and spoke with me. I haven't like gone door to door looking for that kind of stuff. But yeah, there are a lot of local collections. I know I've worked on projects on my other job where we were working in a farm field. We found some stuff here and there, but not a lot. And we went next door to the neighbor. I was like, have you ever found anything in these fields? And it's like, boom, like baskets of stuff. And it's incredible the stuff that people have found, absolutely. And it's important for that stuff to be looked at and documented. But it's just a matter of time and it's people's personal stuff. So but I've seen some of it to answer your question. Yeah.
Especially as an archaeologist, how do you get an idea of those types of things that aren't stones and rocks and building whatever type of shelters they were looking at?
So a lot of that stuff we know about from historical documentation being described by the first Europeans that came here and encountered them. A lot of those things have just survived through, Native Americans have really rich oral cultures where they pass down this information from, their ancestors and their heritage. and they remember how to do all the things that their ancestors did, and sometimes they still practice them. So all of that put together, we've learned about those things. And we have found them archaeologically, not specifically because, their houses are made out of wood, which decays over time, but, we find like the post patterns in the soil, and we can see the circle, the wigwam, and we can kind of get an idea of some of the sizes and the artifacts that were found in them, adjacent to them, and see what their life was like in those kinds of structures. And all of those bits of information kind of go together to create a bigger picture.
If you know this area of Greenwich is an area where people actually kind of live as a village, or if it's kind of.
I'm pretty sure Greenwich, it wasn't intensively occupied, like it wasn't one of those large village sites that are seasonally visited, but because of the Cohansey Quartzite that's mined here, it was revisited frequently, and there are a lot of smaller resource procurement camps, while they're moving here on their seasonal rounds to get access to the stone tools and to shell fishing that time of day, and things like that. I mean, the Cohansey River was a great resource for them, so they were definitely coming through here a lot. I don't think there hasn't been found any very large sites in Greenwich. That doesn't mean they're not here, but we haven't found any.
Online question. Do you know of any of the studies of remains and characteristics, height, etc.?
So studies of like human remains and their characteristics. So right now, in New Jersey and in anywhere in the United States, it's actually illegal to excavate Native American remains. There was a law that was passed in the 90s, I think, on NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which not only requires archaeologists not to excavate Native American graves, because those are the graves of people's ancestors, and they don't want us desecrating them. And they also want museums to be able to identify remains in their collections or grave goods in their collections that belong to these cultures and repatriate and give them back to the cultures that they belong to. So we don't do a lot of archaeological research now on human remains for the Native American period. There have been past studies done on remains from before the NAGPRA law was passed. I'm not sure if any of them have been done in New Jersey. I know that there have been excavations that have turned up human remains in New Jersey. I don't know how extensive their research was on those remains before NAGPRA was passed, and people kind of stopped taking a look at them.
Yeah, his response was, prior to the law, there were skulls in Bridgeton, so it was done.
Yeah, so there have been skulls found in Bridgeton. I don't know how much they've looked at. As far as I understand, I think they're in a private collection right now, and they're kind of awaiting their fate. Yes.
What happens if, suppose like on Route 40, heading to the bridge, the huge, the Amazon center. Suppose they're digging and they find stuff. What would cause it to stop? I mean, does it have to be really significant? Just curious. And if they do find human remains that are ancient, what happens,
That's a fantastic question. Actually, the work that we do for my other job, whenever we find a site that is significant, we have to evaluate it to see exactly how significant it is, if it's worth protections. And if it is worth protection, they will either ask the developer to redesign their project to avoid it. And if they can't avoid it, they have to do what we call a data recovery, which is large excavating a large sample of the site to recover as much data as we can before it's destroyed. The only type of site that I'm aware of in New Jersey that can really stop a development would be a Native American cemetery if Native American remains are found. I don't think there's anything else that would really stop it. No, that's a great question. Yes.
Did you evaluate Black Creek site?
I didn't do it personally. I know the guy who did. I haven't been there. It was before my time. Black Creek. Are there any other questions? Yes.
So would it be safe to assume that the oldest tools and stuff they find are in the northern parts of Americas rather than the southern parts? Because according to your map, they all migrated from north to south, is that right?
Yes.
So then they work their way south into South America, and that's the that these places were inhabited first before South America? Right?
That would stand to reason, yes.
Yeah.
It's really tough to map the earliest people coming here because they were such a low population with a very small archaeological signature. So that's what most theorists assume, and we're looking for a lot of sites like that to try and kind of map the oldest stuff up north. But some of the oldest, originally the oldest site, there are older sites that we found now, but one of the oldest sites that we found, which is between 12 and 14,000 BC, was found at a place called Monte Verde, which is in Chile, which is the like southern tip of South America. So when that was originally found, archaeologists were thrown for a loop because we're like, why is the oldest at the bottom? We have found older stuff since in between, but it's really just a matter of an incomplete archaeological record.
So it's very possible that they could have been migrating from north and south, maybe, and leaving there.
It's possible. It's hard to theorize a route that they would have taken to get to South America. It's much more likely that they came from Siberia, went all the way down to South America, because we have demonstrated that they've been able to people the Americas relatively quickly over just a few centuries, even making it from Siberia to New Jersey. So it's incredible the speed at which they populated the continent. So it's not too much of a stretch to say that they made it all the way down to Chile relatively quickly. Yeah, they're working on finding things like Triquet Island, the site on the northwestern coast where they have really early dates. That's kind of where they're looking right now to see if they can find even earlier stuff that can kind of prove that, that chronology of really old up north and making its way down, but the sample size is just too small. Yeah.
With that earliest immigration route, have you done any comparisons of DNA paths with the migration route to compare how the archaeological record and the DNA paths match?
That's a fantastic question that I wish I knew the answer to. I know work has been done.
Yeah,
I remember reading that work has been done. I'm not very familiar with a lot. I know a lot of times the archaeology and the genetics don't always line up perfectly, and sometimes diverge very significantly. And so they're still working on, marrying those ideas together. But I don't remember exactly what they should go.
There was something on, I wish I had more information and a better memory, but it was something on PBS several years back, not more than 10 years ago though. And it was addressing the people coming across the Bering, but coming down, there was an earlier group that was inland, they said, and then they thought that the newer group went all the way down to South America very rapidly once they used kelp. The kelp forests were in such abundance, and they really the primary sources of food, and they did it by water, so they followed the coast.
I haven't heard that, but that makes a lot of sense.
Well, it probably was known, but
Yeah, it sounds good. Yeah, no, that's really a great idea. There's all kinds of theories as to the peopling of Americas, whether it was, that inland route that I mentioned before, the coastal route. Some people might think that it was both, that people originally came via the coastal route, and there was a second migration after the ice sheets melted and started to pull apart. And that I think is something that a lot of the geneticists would probably have to look at more, because you can see more population particularities in the DNA rather than in the artifacts, because a lot of the artifacts might be similar. Anything else?
I got two questions online. Two questions. One, is it known if they were able to cross Delaware Bay by canoe?
They likely were. Yeah, they
And
were able to. The canoes were actually impressive how wide they were able to hop around. There was a movie. It was produced a while ago called Kon-Tiki. It was just about an experimental archaeologist who was basically seeking out to prove that primitive ship technologies were able to cross oceans. And I've done some work down in the Caribbean, and they did the same way. They were able to use canoes to hop from island to island. So the Delaware Bay probably was not much of an obstacle to them if they really wanted to.
After this talk, where can we learn more about this?
Oh, that is a great question. So some of the good resources for Native American prehistory. I would recommend a visit not only to my museum down here in Greenwich, if you can make it down here, but the New Jersey State Museum has a fantastic gallery on New Jersey's prehistory. The Archaeological Society of New Jersey does a lot of great work and publications. Very good resources. Alan Mounier wrote a fantastic book called Looking Beneath the Surface. I don't know how easy it is to find anymore, but that's definitely one of the better books.
Get that on Amazon.
You can get it on Amazon? Oh, great. Good, I need to restock. Thank you. And the Archaeological Society of New Jersey is also selling copies of Herbert Kraft's book on Delaware Indian heritage, and that one, that's a monster, but it's really all of the information you can need is in there, and they're selling that online. You could also reach out to me. I don't know, we can post somewhere my email address or something like that.
What about on the native side? Are there resources in the general area for, I mean, from the native peoples themselves?
Right.
I know there's that Commerce Street in Bridgeton, there's the new.
Yes.
It's hard to find open.
Right.
So, is it better?
Okay. That would be my first place to show you. She seems
We
to
have
have
a couple.
great books.
We are still here, tribal flag on the New Jersey United Covenant by Chief John Woodland, and Strong Medicine Speaks, which was put out by 500 Historical Society. They're both written in Woodland.
There's a museum in Brooklyn too that I know just opened an exhibit that was curated by Native Americans, which would probably be the resource. I haven't been there yet. But, I just recently.
Brooklyn?
It's in Brooklyn. I don't remember which museum it is. That was good. And I know the Smithsonian Museum of the American Indian was also curated by Native American curators, which is great to see that perspective. Yes.
Have you identified the sites listed in NJDEP/NJGS Bulletin 9 that identifies the sites on the Cohansey?
Yes, so the Bulletin 9 was it was a publication from some of the earliest archaeological work done in New Jersey by Alison Skinner and Max Strabish. It was 1913 or 1915, I get them mixed up. But they did a lot of the early work with the New Jersey Geological Survey, documenting sites throughout the entire state. And they identified a lot of sites along the Cohansey River.
How do we get that?
It's available online. You can just like Google search like Bulletin 9 New Jersey Geological Survey Archaeology, something like that. It usually pops up. It's on the DEP website.
Can they be identified today?
The sites, could they be re-identified?
Yeah, I think it's a follow-up question to the last one.
Some of them, it depends. A lot of the research that's done, like I mentioned before, is precluded by development. So a lot of times these sites will kind of just sit there until they're directly threatened by development. And a firm like mine might get hired to take a look at the area and say, hey, are there any sites here? And then we refer to those early surveys and later surveys and do all of our background research. You say, hey, someone found something here a while ago. If we can find where it was, a lot of those early surveys aren't the most accurate as to where they pinpointed where stuff was. But, yeah, so that's usually how that stuff gets re-identified. It's real do that kind of work. Otherwise, it sits.
And what is the name of your business?
I work for a company called Richard Grubb and Associates.
You can register a site, there's a form you can get.
Yes, so
Register a site.
yeah, so if you know where an archaeological site is, you can contact the New Jersey State Museum, and they will check and they'll see if it's already registered, and if not, they can work you through the process of registering. There's a form to fill out, and you can say, this is what I found here. Sometimes you need to name the site, and that gets documented for researchers like me. Anything else?
So we still have a state archaeologist?
We do. His name is Gregory Latanzi, and he's really incredible at what he does. And a great resource as well. He's very friendly. He works at the New Jersey State Museum. So the state archaeologist is also a curator of the New Jersey State Museum. It's like a dual position.
I think a gentleman that's been sending questions says thank you, very informative online, and thank you so much. If no one else has any questions, thank you so much for your research and presenting everything for us.
Happy to. Thank you guys for great questions.
Thank you to everyone that attended and thank you for everyone that's live. Have a great day.
When will the museum be open again?
April 2nd.
April 2nd. Thank you. Can I get a picture of that?
Yeah, absolutely.